The auditorium trembled with restless murmurs, lights glaring off polished wood and watchful eyes. Kash Patel gripped the podium like a hammer ready to strike. His voice cut through the hush, sharp, dismissive, echoing against every wall. "She's nothing but an unqualified politician," he declared, dragging each word out like a gavel crashing down. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Camera phones rose like 1,000 tiny spotlights, capturing the instant he tried to brand her as less than what she was. In the front row, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat with her hands folded, shoulders squared, gaze steady. Her eyes held a flicker of something between patience and fire, a quiet storm waiting to break. Around her, allies stiffened, jaws tight. Above, the giant screens replayed Patel's line again and again, "Unqualified politician," as if daring the crowd to believe it. On social feeds, hashtags exploded, trending before the words had even left his lips. Hashtag unqualified or hashtag unstoppable. People typed furiously, taking sides, hearts racing as if they were in the room. Commentators whispered into their microphones, news tickers rolled across screens, and somewhere a young viewer scrolling at home felt the sting of seeing yet another rising figure reduced to a stereotype. Patel smirked, mistaking silence for victory. He leaned into the microphone again, hoping to press his advantage, to freeze Crockett in that moment and define her for the world. But her opponent's composure was a mirror held up to his arrogance, reflecting it, refracting it, diminishing it. Each second she remained calm, the room began to shift, the balance of power tilting almost imperceptibly away from him. Then Crockett lifted her head and met his gaze. Not a word yet, just the steady, unbroken stare of someone who had endured worse storms and refused to bow. For a heartbeat, time slowed. The tension in the crowd, the blinking red lights of recording cameras, and the collective inhale of an audience sensing history. But no one in the room could have predicted how she would answer next. Long before the confrontation made its way onto timelines and evening broadcasts, a subtler story had been unfolding. Kash Patel's jab at Jasmine Crockett was not an isolated remark, but the loudest echo of a familiar refrain, that new voices, especially women of color with working-class roots, must somehow prove themselves twice over just to stand on the same stage. His words carried the weight of decades of coded dismissal, and everyone in the room felt the sting, even if they couldn't name it. The insult wasn't simply about one politician. It was a message about who gets to belong, who gets to speak, and who is deemed qualified to lead. Crockett's rise had been anything but overnight. For years, she had moved through hearings, town halls, and community meetings with the same measured tone now on display. Her reputation as a tireless advocate for fairness had earned her respect among grassroots organizers, immigration reformers, and working families. She wasn't just a new face in the political arena. She represented a movement of people determined to see themselves reflected in the halls of power. In the weeks leading up to this moment, she had gained a quiet but steady momentum. Small donors, civic endorsements, and an online following drawn to her calm ferocity. Yet for all her preparation, she knew this exchange was dangerous. Political insiders whispered that Patel's attack was calculated, a test designed to corner her, to make her react emotionally, to brand her as yet another fleeting headline. Commentators floated the phrase career-ending moment in off-camera chatter, some even texting producers mid-show that this could be the slip that defined her forever. The stakes weren't just personal, they were symbolic. If Patel could successfully reduce Crockett to a caricature, it would be a cautionary tale to every rising figure watching.
News networks replayed Patel's remark with split-screen shots of Crockett's face. Headlines blared, "Unqualified or unstoppable," and "Clash signals turning point in local politics." The coverage wasn't neutral. It carried the voyeuristic thrill of a public reckoning. Social media turned into a digital arena where strangers argued in real time about her worth, her experience, her identity. Even allies wondered aloud in threads, would she swing back or stand still? Inside the venue, tension hung like static. Patel surrogates sat upright, eyes darting from one reaction to another, while Crockett's supporters pressed their lips into thin lines, praying she wouldn't lose composure. The flash of cameras painted the room in staccato bursts, each shot another piece of evidence for a public already forming its judgment. But Crockett's silence in that first instant wasn't weakness, it was strategy. She had built her credibility not through grandstanding, but through precision, through knowing when to hold fire and when to release it. That composure was now her greatest weapon. She understood that in politics, timing is everything. One well-placed truth can upend an entire narrative. And as Patel's words still reverberated, she was preparing the truth that would do just that. Viewers watching at home could sense it. Something historic was about to unfold. Tweets slowed as people held their breath, waiting for the moment they'd replay again and again. Patel believed he had trapped her, but the trap was already reversing, and the stage was about to tilt under his feet.
Before the moment on stage, before the flash of headlines and the swirl of hashtags, Kash Patel had already built a reputation for stepping into the limelight with an unshakable grin and a sharpened blade of rhetoric. His career traced a path from obscure staffer to power insider, moving through corridors of influence where loyalty mattered more than truth, and spectacle eclipsed substance. He had learned early that political combat was not only about policy, but about perception, about how to bend a narrative until it snapped into a headline that served him. Behind closed doors, Patel cultivated the image of a tactician, always the man with a file folder under his arm, a whisper ready for a reporter, a leak timed to perfection. Allies called him a master strategist, critics called him a provocateur. In private meetings, he would rehearse attacks, testing which line would wound deepest, which phrase would ricochet across social media. He built his career on audacity, convinced that every controversy could be turned to his advantage if he doubled down rather than backed away. Yet his public persona was that of a consummate insider who'd earned his place, framing himself as the voice of the hardened establishment taking on naive newcomers. This duality, one man in the shadows, another on camera, became his trademark, and for a long time it worked. He could ignite outrage, watch his targets flail, and then pose as the calm, collected adult in the room. Each attack left a dent in someone's reputation, and each dent burnished his own. But cracks had started to show. Some of Patel's earlier campaigns against rivals had boomeranged, spawning ethics inquiries and public skepticism. Whispers in Washington corridors suggested that the self-styled kingmaker might be losing his touch. Where once he commanded instant deference, now he inspired eye rolls in backrooms and double takes on cable panels. Still, he persisted, believing his instinct for the jugular would always triumph over restraint. The confrontation with Jasmine Crockett was meant to be another of his choreographed takedowns. In his mind, it would unfold like a play. He would label her unqualified, she would sputter or lash out, and the public would watch her unravel while he stood above the fray. The remark itself had been tested in private conversations, its sting calibrated for maximum effect. To him, it wasn't just an insult, it was a strategic strike meant to end her momentum before it began. In the days leading up to the event, Patel's team circulated talking points framing Crockett as a flash-in-the-pan politician, someone whose popularity rested on style rather than substance. They prepped sympathetic pundits to echo the unqualified theme in the aftermath. They even timed a press release to hit inboxes minutes after the confrontation, ensuring that his framing would dominate the news cycle. Yet, even as Patel rehearsed his blow, he overlooked the changing dynamics of the audience he was about to face. This was not a closed-door committee hearing or a partisan rally. It was a public forum watched by a younger, more diverse audience, many of whom saw in Crockett their own struggles to be taken seriously. His usual playbook, attack, mock, declare victory, would not automatically succeed here. As he paced backstage that evening, Patel projected confidence. He adjusted his tie, scrolled through his phone, glanced at the script his aides had printed. He thought of the headlines that would follow, the victory lap on morning shows, the surge of donors. But beneath the surface, a quieter reality tugged at the edges of his certainty. His last few skirmishes had not gone as planned. Audiences were growing weary of the theatrics. Commentators were starting to ask harder questions. Still, he dismissed those doubts. In his mind, this confrontation was a low-risk opportunity to reassert dominance. If Crockett failed to respond forcefully, he would paint her as weak. If she snapped back angrily, he would label her unprofessional. Either way, he would win. That was the beauty of his design, or so he believed. What Patel could not see from his vantage point at the podium was the shift in the crowd's eyes. They were no longer simply spectators, they were witnesses, measuring his performance against their own lived experience. Each smirk he gave, each condescending inflection, deepened the sense that he was not merely attacking one woman, but the broader idea of inclusion itself. The camera cut between his face, confident, almost amused, and Jasmine Crockett's quiet steel in her eyes. This juxtaposition, broadcast in real time to thousands of screens, began undermining his framing before he even finished his line. In his attempt to cast her as unqualified, he was inadvertently casting himself as something else, a bully who mistook bravado for authority.
Long before she stood beneath the auditorium lights, facing Catel's barbed words, Jasmine Crockett's life had been defined by uphill climbs and quiet defiance. She was born into a working-class family on the south side of a bustling city, where neighbors knew each other's names and the scent of street food mingled with the distant hum of freeway traffic. Her parents worked long shifts, her mother as a nurse's aide, her father fixing engines in a garage, teaching her that dignity did not come from titles, but from perseverance and service. They insisted she speak up in class, even when her accent or clothes set her apart. Those early lessons, resilience, self-respect, and a sense of collective duty, were the soil from which her public life would grow. In school, Jasmine gravitated toward debate clubs and community projects rather than cliques. She became known as the girl who wouldn't back down when a teacher underestimated her, yet she was also the one who helped classmates study late into the night. Those twin instincts, to challenge and to uplift, followed her into adulthood. While friends sought safer paths, she pushed herself through college and law school, often holding 2 jobs to afford tuition. She interned at legal aid clinics, representing people who had been ignored or written off, honing the skill of listening deeply before speaking decisively. Her first real political fight was not in a marble-floored chamber, but on the steps of a neighborhood courthouse, advocating for families facing eviction. She remembered the trembling hands of a mother clutching an eviction notice, the weary eyes of a grandfather battling a zoning law. She discovered the change was not abstract policy, but human survival. Her reputation for patience and steel began here. She did not shout, but she did not yield. Even her adversaries came to respect that she prepared meticulously and delivered her arguments with a calm intensity that drew attention without theatrics. Over the next decade, Crockett built a record as a public defender, then as a state legislator who chose substance over spectacle. She championed immigrant rights, expanded access to education, and fought for wage protections. Her speeches threaded together personal testimony and data, creating narratives that were both emotional and unassailable. Her style stood in stark contrast to the soundbite politics around her. She did not chase headlines, yet headlines began to chase her. By the time she entered national politics, she had already endured a dozen moments when pundits predicted her collapse. Each time she was labeled too young, too idealistic, or not ready to lead, she transformed the skepticism into fuel. She had learned to let insults hang in the air like smoke until they dissipated, leaving her stronger than before. Her calm demeanor was not timidity, but a studied discipline forged through years of preparation and bruising encounters. In the months leading to the confrontation with Patel, Crockett's profile surged quietly but unmistakably. While establishment figures sparred over poll numbers, she held listening sessions in community centers. While rivals focused on partisan theater, she negotiated small but vital amendments in committees, earning cross-aisle respect. These actions gave her a deep bench of credibility, something less visible than a viral clip, but infinitely more resilient. She knew that real power lay not in a single soundbite, but in the trust of people who had watched her show up again and again without fail. Friends and aides describe her as a slow burn, someone whose impact accumulates until suddenly it's undeniable. She prefers handwritten thank you notes to choreographed photo ops. She remembers the names of interns. She still volunteers at the legal aid clinic where she once interned. All of these details formed an image of a public servant grounded in principle rather than ambition. Her critics often underestimated her because she did not posture. Her supporters adored her for the same reason. This pattern, being underestimated and then surpassing expectations, had repeated so many times that by the night of Patel's insult, it had become almost a reflex. She had already endured countless attempts to frame her as less qualified, less experienced, less entitled to lead. Each time she answered not with volume, but with precision. This gave her a rare credibility among young voters, especially immigrants and first-generation Americans, who saw in her a reflection of their own struggle for recognition. As she sat on that stage, hands folded, eyes steady, all this history lived within her. She remembered the courtroom steps, the all-night study sessions, the skeptical glances from senior colleagues. She remembered her parents' quiet insistence that dignity outlasts mockery. Every setback had taught her to prepare, not only with facts, but with composure, not only with argument, but with presence. Her calm at that moment was not accidental. It was the apex of a lifetime of training.
The air inside the auditorium had shifted from curious tension to electric anticipation. Every eye darted between the two figures at the center of the stage, Kash Patel gripping the microphone like a cudgel, Jasmine Crockett seated upright, her hands still folded. What had begun as a single jab was becoming a barrage. Patel sensed the cameras and leaned in, his voice swelling with confidence. "You can dress it up however you want," he said, his words clipped and deliberate. "But this country deserves qualified leadership, not grandstanding from people who don't belong at the table." A low rumble swept through the audience. Some gasped, others murmured in disbelief. A cluster of college students in the back row exchanged looks, their phones already up, fingers flying across screens. Within seconds, Twitter flashed with fragments of the exchange, short clips, bold captions, reaction gifs of raised eyebrows and slow claps. Hashtag Crockett versus Patel and hashtag unqualified began trending side by side, dueling narratives in real time. Patel pressed on, sensing the flicker of virality. He gestured toward Crockett without looking directly at her, his smile thin and practiced.
You've built a social media following, but you haven't built a record. You've got slogans, not solutions." The words were meant to sting, to push her into an emotional corner. Even the lighting seemed to shift. His side of the stage bright and glaring, hers calm but shattered, as if the moment itself were a painting of contrast. Crockett didn't blink. She adjusted a single fold in her jacket, her eyes steady on the table in front of her, waiting. A flicker of confusion crossed Patel's face. He'd expected a reaction, a flash of indignation, a retort, a slip. Instead, he was playing to a silence that magnified every word he uttered. On social media, viewers split into camps. Some mocked Patel's overconfidence with looping gifs of crumbling towers. Others rallied behind him, cheering what they saw as tough truth. But an emerging narrative was forming, subtle yet powerful. Crockett's composure was its own statement, her stillness a counterweight to his aggression. He pivoted to her policy record, rattling off cherry-picked statistics meant to sound like scandals. "Let's talk about real leadership, because leadership isn't about feelings, it's about facts, and your record doesn't hold up." His voice cracked just slightly on facts, but the microphone amplified it into a quiver. The audience caught it, and a murmur of laughter broke out on one side of the hall. Crockett looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since his opening insult. The crowd leaned forward. Patel's words slowed, then quickened again, as if he was trying to outrun the unease creeping into his own tone. And the more he spoke, the more it sounded like justification rather than attack. Behind them, the big screens played a split screen, Patel's hand gestures, Crockett's stillness. Commentators whispered into their headsets, producers scribbled frantic notes. A chyron appeared on one network feed, 10th Showdown Live. Even neutral observers could sense a shift, the classic rhythm of a power play beginning to falter. Patel tried humor, a smirk designed to belittle. "If you're waiting for your turn, Representative, don't worry, I'll give you the floor when I'm done." The words dripped condescension. A few scattered boos echoed from the back rows. A young woman in the audience whispered, "She's about to end him," and her friend nodded, eyes wide. Crockett exhaled slowly, a nearly invisible movement, but enough to send a ripple through her supporters. They recognized the signal. She was loading her response. Patel, oblivious, doubled down one last time. "People like you," he said, voice rising, "think you can bypass experience and leapfrog into leadership, but the American people deserve better." The room went utterly still. Even the glow of phone screens seemed to dim. Patel straightened his notes, clearly satisfied he had cornered her. But what he saw as a trap, she saw as an opening. On social media, the tone shifted again. Memes of storm clouds gathering over a calm sea began appearing under Crockett's name. A popular account tweeted, "She's about to make history. Watch." The hashtag calm before the storm overtook hashtag unqualified within minutes. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began her counterattack.
The auditorium held its breath. Kash Patel, confident and poised just moments ago, was now leaning slightly forward, waiting for the storm he assumed was about to break. But Jasmine Crockett remained seated, her fingers interlaced, eyes tracing a slow arc over the audience, taking measure of every person in the room before she spoke. She drew in a quiet breath, almost imperceptible, and then released it. That small, deliberate motion was the first signal that everything was about to change. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and precise. "Let's take a step back," she began, her tone disarming in its neutrality. The words hung in the air like a weightless blade, forcing Patel to pause mid-gesture. Leadership isn't about who shouts the loudest or who casts the sharpest insult. It's about the people you serve, the challenges you meet head-on, and the results you deliver. A subtle murmur ran through the audience, a soft acknowledgement that she had taken the first step in reclaiming the narrative. She paused again,
letting the silence stretch just long enough to amplify her presence. Cameras lingered on her face, capturing the calm intensity that had been built over years of scrutiny, setbacks, and victories. She didn't need theatrics. The quiet confidence was its own argument. Patel shifted slightly, clearing his throat, a faint crease forming between his brows. For the first time, the self-assured smirk faltered. Crockett's next words carried weight, not through volume, but through sharp precision. "You accuse me of lacking experience," she continued, "yet my record stands. I have spent years fighting for families threatened with eviction, for communities neglected by broken systems, for children who have been told their voices don't matter. My experience isn't measured in applause, it's measured in lives changed." The audience reacted instantly, a collective intake of breath, eyes widening, the subtle shift of leaning forward in seats. Phones were raised, tweets began to appear in real time, describing her as composed, unstoppable, a force of calm truth. Patel attempted to interrupt, gesturing toward her with a pointed hand, but she didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact. She allowed the interruption to hang for a beat, then delivered a rhetorical pivot that struck like a hammer. "And for those who think visibility equals impact," she said, "let me remind you, change often happens quietly, behind closed doors, long before the cameras catch up. While some prefer to craft narratives from insults, I have chosen to craft results." A subtle ripple of applause ran through the crowd. Even some of Patel's supporters paused, unsure if they should cheer or remain silent. The build-up had been meticulous, every word a measured strike designed to unsettle without aggression. And then came the revelation, a fact that shifted the entire narrative. Crockett leaned slightly forward, her voice lowering, almost intimate, as if sharing a secret the world needed to hear. "Last year, when legislation threatened to cut essential healthcare funding in my district, I worked with both sides of the aisle, negotiating for every clinic, every nurse, every patient who would have been left behind. Those decisions weren't headlines, they were lifelines. And those are the results that define my qualifications, not social media following, not spin, not rhetoric." The audience erupted. Gasps, cheers, applause, the sound rising and falling like waves in a storm. Cameras panned to faces painted with disbelief and admiration, capturing the raw human reaction to a truth laid bare. Social media flared with activity. Clips of her statement looped endlessly. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Crockett delivers, hashtag truth over taunt, and memes celebrating her calm precision circulated faster than Patel's own clips. Even political analysts, caught live, leaned forward in astonishment, muttering phrases like, "She just dismantled him in real time," and "that was surgical." Patel's confidence, once immovable, began to crumble. His gestures grew erratic, his tone defensive. "That's just one example," he muttered, but the conviction behind his words faltered under the weight of her narrative. Every word she had prepared acted like a mirror, reflecting the inadequacy of his attack back onto him. He attempted humor, a feeble quip intended to regain dominance, but it fell flat, met with a smattering of polite claps that barely masked the audience's impatience. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her fist. Her power came from timing, from cadence, and precision. She allowed each statement to land fully before moving to the next, letting the audience absorb, evaluate, and internalize. Then she added a personal anecdote, subtle but devastating in its emotional clarity, a story of a young immigrant she had helped navigate the legal system, someone who had been dismissed, ignored, and underestimated, until Crockett's intervention turned fear into possibility. The crowd leaned in, phones captured the moment. A young woman in the front row whispered, "This is why we need her."
Patel's attempts to interrupt were increasingly futile. He gestured, opened his mouth, but every motion seemed rehearsed, mechanical, a shadow of the spontaneity Crockett exuded. She continued, smoothly pivoting back to facts, data, and principle. Her rebuttals were layered. Each one answered a point he had made while simultaneously elevating the stakes, reframing the conversation not as a personal attack, but as a broader battle over dignity, competence, and justice. By now, the auditorium had transformed. What had started as a confrontation had become a performance of virtue and calm power. Every camera lens caught Patel's faltering smirk, his shifting weight, the tiny beads of sweat forming on his brow. Every viewer at home could sense the pivot. The narrative no longer belonged to him. His calculated attack, once a weapon, now amplified her strength. Finally, Crockett delivered the mic-drop line that sealed the moment. Her voice calm, deliberate, filled with both authority and empathy. Leadership is not claimed through insults. Leadership is earned through action, integrity, and commitment to those you serve. That is my record. That is my promise, and that is what I will continue to deliver, not for headlines, not for applause, but for the people who deserve it. The crowd erupted into sustained applause, cheers rolling over the stage, punctuated by chants of support. Patel's notes lay untouched on the podium, his opening lines already obsolete. Social media captured the crescendo. Video clips went viral in seconds, gifs of Crockett's calm stare multiplied, and commentators scrambled to redefine the narrative mid-broadcast. Memes appeared praising her strategic brilliance, her composure, her humanity. In that moment, it was clear that the stage no longer belonged to the man who started with insults. The audience, the cameras, and the digital world itself had shifted allegiance. Patel's overconfidence had collided with Crockett's preparation, and in the collision, her heroism was fully illuminated. She had not just defended herself, she had elevated the conversation, turning a personal attack into a moral demonstration of competence, dignity, and perseverance.
The moment had passed, but the world had already moved. Screens lit up across the country, phones, tablets, TVs, each broadcasting the same truth. Jasmine Crockett had not just responded, she had dominated with poise, precision, and principle. Social media exploded in real time. Hashtags trended within minutes. Hashtag Crockett wins. Hashtag calm before the storm. Hashtag leadership defined. Clips of her measured rebuttal looped endlessly, shared by viewers who had never followed her before, but now couldn't look away. Every tweet, every post carried a sense of disbelief and admiration. People were watching a masterclass in composure, and they wanted the world to see it too. Political commentators scrambled to adjust their talking points. Initially, many had expected Patel to come out on top, a textbook takedown, as one analyst had predicted on live television. But by the end of Crockett's calm yet devastating response, those predictions lay in ruins. On cable panels, pundits whispered into microphones, praising her clarity and the sheer force of restraint. Even conservative commentators, usually quick to dismiss rising figures from diverse backgrounds, were forced to acknowledge the artistry of her performance. That was surgical, one said. It's rare to see someone handle attacks like that and turn them into a defining moment. Memes and reaction GIFs flooded platforms. Crockett's calm stare frozen mid-counterpoint. Patel's faltering gestures highlighted in split screens. Captions reading, "Confidence greater than arrogance," and "Patel tried, Crockett triumphed." TikTok creators remixed the clips, layering dramatic music and slow-motion effects, portraying the confrontation as a cinematic showdown. The virality wasn't just about entertainment, it was validation, a collective recognition that someone had risen above personal attacks and systemic dismissal to embody competence, dignity, and truth. Patel's team, meanwhile, was in disarray. In private group chats, aides typed frantically, trying to salvage the narrative, drafting statements to spin what had clearly gone wrong. Press releases were rewritten midstream, attempting to pivot the story toward technicalities or minor victories. Behind the polished facade of confident messaging, there was panic, because Crockett's poise had rewritten the script, and there was no prepared response for someone who refused to break under pressure. Analysts noted that this wasn't merely a win in a debate, it was a public relations earthquake. Meanwhile, Crockett's supporters celebrated in real time. Community leaders shared clips in WhatsApp groups, local newspapers posted commentary praising her composure, and young voters tweeted personal stories about how her example inspired them to believe that dignity could withstand the loudest insults. "She represents all of us who've ever been underestimated," one viral tweet read, summing up the emotional resonance of the moment. Another user posted a heartfelt thread detailing how Crockett's calm courage reminded them of their parents' sacrifices and the struggles they faced as first-generation Americans. Even rivals who might have sought to minimize her moment struggled to avoid acknowledging it. Politicians who had previously dismissed her quietly offered praise in interviews, noting that her command of the room, her clarity under pressure, and her ability to pivot insults into lessons for the public marked her as someone to watch. The ripple effect extended beyond politics. Educators, activists, and journalists all shared their admiration, framing Crockett not only as a skilled debater, but as a symbol of integrity in public life. The broader media cycle reflected this validation. Major news networks replayed the confrontation multiple times, dissecting her arguments, highlighting her composure, and contrasting it with Patel's faltering performance. Opinion columns lauded her as a model of leadership for the new generation, someone who could challenge systemic biases without succumbing to anger or fear. Social media debates evolved into discussions of identity, representation, and the power of measured courage, extending Crockett's influence far beyond the initial stage. Meanwhile, the digital community ensured the moment lived on. Memes, tweets, reaction videos, and threads proliferated with lightning speed. Each post served as social proof, a collective acknowledgement that Crockett had triumphed not only in the confrontation itself, but in the hearts and minds of viewers across the nation. Audiences everywhere were seeing a version of leadership that combined intelligence, empathy, and emotional control, a model that resonated particularly strongly with progressive, immigrant-friendly communities who valued validation and inspiration in the figures they followed. Yet for all the applause and viral acclaim, one reality remained. Patel's attack had been intended to define Crockett in the public eye, but the attempt had backfired spectacularly. The narrative he had sought to control had escaped his grasp entirely, and for the first time in a long while, he was reacting, not directing. Meanwhile, Crockett's team celebrated quietly, knowing the impact of the moment was already multiplying in ways that could not be orchestrated or bought. Yet as the dust settled, one question lingered. What larger message did this moment send about power and dignity?
In the aftermath of the confrontation, the noise of debate faded into a deeper resonance. Jasmine Crockett's response had done more than silence or detractor. It had illuminated a universal truth. Dignity holds more power than derision, and steadfast principle outlasts fleeting spectacle. She had demonstrated that leadership is not performed for cameras or applause, but embodied through consistent action, unwavering ethics, and service to the greater good. What some had tried to diminish with insult, she had transformed into an enduring lesson on integrity. Across the nation, commentators paused, reflecting not on the drama, but on the meaning behind it. Analysts dissected her composure and precision, noting how her refusal to engage in theatrics revealed a new model of political authority. "This is leadership for a modern era," one anchor said, voice tinged with awe. "One that values empathy, preparation, and moral courage above ego or bravado." Opinion writers framed the exchange not as a victory in debate, but as a blueprint for accountability and resilience in public service. In communities far from the spotlight, citizens found their own reflections in Crockett's example.
Social media threads filled with stories of individuals overcoming workplace bias, systemic obstacles, or moments of personal doubt. A young immigrant in Texas wrote, "Watching her stay calm while being attacked reminds me that I can stand tall even when the world doubts me." In Chicago, a high school civics teacher shared the clip with her students, using it as a case study in dignity under pressure, illustrating that leadership is about courage, not aggression. From town halls to virtual classrooms, the message rippled outward, tangible and inspiring. Her victory was not only personal, it became symbolic. She had shown that a single moment of grace and intellect could counteract years of prejudice and dismissive attitudes. It reframed the conversation around what it means to earn respect, not through bluster or force, but through preparation, empathy, and moral clarity. Crockett's story reminded viewers that the ability to respond thoughtfully, even when provoked, could reshape not only the outcome of a debate, but the broader culture in which such contests take place. The montage of reactions was telling. Young people cheered in living rooms, teachers applauded quietly in classrooms, office workers shared clips with colleagues, and community leaders tweeted admiration for a figure who embodied their own ideals. Her composure became a rallying point, a reference for those seeking to navigate personal and professional challenges with integrity. Every nod of recognition, every shared post, reinforced a single lesson. Respect and truth are forms of power that endure longer than the fleeting satisfaction of insult. Crockett herself remained aware of the moment's significance. She did not allow the applause or virality to inflate her ego. Instead, she leaned into the responsibility it represented, a reminder that every decision, every response, and every opportunity to act with principle mattered far beyond the stage. Leadership, she knew, is cumulative. Each act of integrity, each demonstration of dignity contributes to a larger movement of accountability, fairness, and justice. And yet, the power of the moment lay not in her victory over Patel, but in the collective awakening it inspired. Across digital spaces, in classrooms, and in community centers, people began to see that standing firm in principle was not merely a political tactic, it was a moral stance with real-world consequences. Young voters felt validated in their insistence on leaders who reflected their values. Immigrant communities saw representation not only in her presence, but in the courage with which she defended it. Across the spectrum, viewers understood that she had transformed a personal attack into a lesson on resilience, ethics, and vision. In the end, the confrontation became more than an exchange of words. It was a masterclass in patience, strategy, and the enduring power of moral authority. Crockett reframed the conflict from a contest of ego to a lesson in dignity, creating a narrative that transcended politics. The applause faded, the cameras powered down, and yet the lesson endured, echoing in the minds of anyone who had witnessed it. And as she walked away from the stage, a new movement was quietly beginning.
Kash Patel's words, unqualified politician, were meant to define Jasmine Crockett, to reduce her to a label, to silence her before she could speak. But in a twist that would ripple far beyond that stage, those same words became the spark for her most decisive moment. Every accusation, every insult, every attempt to corner her only illuminated her preparation, her composure, and her unwavering dedication to service. What was intended as a blow became the catalyst for triumph, turning a personal attack into a universal lesson about courage, dignity, and integrity. Across the nation, viewers witnessed the power of calm truth. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she elevated the conversation. She reminded everyone watching, especially those who have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they don't belong,
that leadership is earned through action, empathy, and steadfast principles, not through ego or spectacle. She showed that integrity isn't passive, it's active, deliberate, and unshakable, even under the harshest scrutiny. Now it's your turn to be part of this story. Share this moment. Talk about it with friends, family, and colleagues. Let others see that dignity can outshine derision, and that courage can be both quiet and transformative. Subscribe to follow stories like this, where truth rises above attack, and where voices often ignored find the strength to inspire millions. Engage, comment, and join a community that celebrates leadership defined by action and principle, not posturing or insults. Because moments like this don't just entertain, they teach, they empower, and they remind us all that the people who stand firm in truth, who act with integrity, and who rise above the noise deserve an audience. Jasmine Crockett proved it on that stage, and now it's your turn to carry that lesson forward.